The Battle of White Plains, fought on October 28, 1776, was an important engagement during the American Revolutionary War. It took place in White Plains, New York, and was part of the ongoing series of clashes between the Continental Army, led by General George Washington, and the British forces commanded by General William Howe. While the battle did not result in a decisive victory for either side, it was significant for its strategic consequences and its impact on the morale of the Continental Army. Background to the battle. By October 1776, the British had already gained a series of victories in New York, beginning with their triumph in the Battle of Long Island in late August. Following this, the British captured New York City and forced Washington's Continental Army to retreat across the East River into Manhattan. Washington's army had been steadily pushed northward, with the British relentlessly pursuing them. After the fall of Manhattan, Washington recognized the need to stop the British advance and create a defensive position to slow down their momentum. The British forces, numbering around 14,000 soldiers, were making their way northward through Westchester County, while the Continental Army, now numbering about 14,500 troops, was positioned near White Plains. Washington knew that the British intended to push further into the colonies, potentially cutting off vital supply routes and threatening the Continental Army's survival. He decided to make a stand at White Plains, located on a plateau in the lower Hudson Valley, to create a strong defensive position. The forces involved. The Continental Army was commanded by General George Washington, who had about 14,000 men at his disposal. These forces included regular Continental soldiers and militia units. While Washington's army was larger than the British forces in the region, the Continental Army was relatively inexperienced and lacked the advanced artillery and discipline that the British forces possessed. General Howe commanded the British forces, which included approximately 14,000 men, including regular British troops, German Hessian mercenaries and loyalist units. The British were well trained and experienced in battle, having successfully taken New York City just weeks before. Howe's forces were augmented by naval superiority, which allowed them to maneuver and resupply with relative ease. The battle unfolds. On October 28, 1776, the British Army began their move to dislodge the Continental forces from White Plains. Howe sought to outflank the Americans and force them into a retreat. The Americans had fortified their position on the heights of White Plains, setting up defensive lines with cannons and riflemen positioned on key terrain features to cover potential British approaches. The British began the battle by advancing on the American defenses. The Continental Army was positioned in a strong defensive line along a series of hills and ridges, which gave them a natural advantage. Howe's plan was to attempt a flanking maneuver, sending a portion of his forces around the American left flank in an attempt to cut off their retreat and encircle them. In the initial skirmishes, both sides exchanged artillery fire and engaged in small battles along the American lines. The Americans held firm but were forced to withdraw from their original positions when Howe's flanking maneuver began to gain traction. Washington ordered a retreat to a stronger defensive position further north in the direction of North Castle, where his army could regroup and prepare for further action. While the British made progress in pushing the Americans back, the battle did not result in a decisive victory for either side. The British failed to completely break through the American lines, and Washington's retreat was well executed, allowing his forces to withdraw in good order. Although the Americans lost ground, they managed to avoid a catastrophic defeat. Aftermath and significance. While the Battle of White Plains did not lead to a clear victory, it had several important consequences. First, Washington's ability to conduct an orderly retreat and maintain his forces in the field demonstrated his leadership and the resilience of the Continental Army. Washington's defensive tactics, combined with his knowledge of the terrain, allowed him to slow the British advance and avoid a crushing blow. After the battle, General Howe did not immediately pursue Washington's retreating forces. Instead, he moved to capture other strategic locations, but the Americans managed to maintain control of the Hudson River and other key areas. The British, though they had won the battle in terms of ground gained, failed to destroy the Continental Army or achieve a decisive breakthrough. The Battle of White Plains also marked a shift in the overall strategy of the American forces. Washington had successfully avoided a major defeat and bought his army time to regroup. His ability to adapt and conduct retreats without panicking helped maintain morale in the Continental Army and the American cause. In the aftermath, Washington continued to conduct defensive operations, avoiding large-scale engagements until a more opportune moment. The battle's psychological impact. Though not a clear military victory, the Battle of White Plains had significant psychological effects. The British were unable to deliver a crushing blow to the Continental Army, which continued to exist as a viable force. On the other hand, the Americans, although they lost ground, managed to retreat in an orderly fashion and preserve their fighting capability. This was critical for sustaining the revolutionary effort and keeping hope alive among the American public and soldiers. Additionally, the Americans continued to build their alliance with France during this period, which would eventually lead to crucial foreign support in the war. Maintaining a fighting force was essential to that diplomatic effort, and Washington's leadership in the Battle of White Plains helped ensure the survival of the Continental Army. Conclusion. The Battle of White Plains was an important moment in the American Revolutionary War. While it did not result in a clear victory, the battle showcased Washington's skill as a leader and the resilience of the Continental Army. By slowing the British advance and maintaining the ability to fight another day, the Continental Army remained a viable force in the conflict for independence. The battle served as a reminder that even when facing overwhelming odds, the American forces could hold their own against the mighty British Army, a crucial psychological victory in the ongoing struggle for freedom.